James Carver was sitting at his kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in late June when he noticed the clock on the microwave flicker for the third time that week. It was barely past 7, the sun already heating the vinyl siding on his suburban ranch house in a quiet development outside Indianapolis, and his wife Rebecca was pouring orange juice into 3 plastic cups while their 2 teenage daughters scrolled through their phones with the practiced indifference of people who had never known a morning without electricity. The flicker lasted maybe a second, just long enough for the digital display to go dark before the numbers reappeared, glowing green against the black plastic face. Rebecca glanced at it, shrugged in that way that meant she had noticed but did not consider it worth discussing, and went back to breakfast. James kept his eyes on the clock a moment longer, watching for another flicker that did not come, then looked out the window at the transformer box mounted on the utility pole at the corner of his yard. The hum was there, steady and electric, the same hum that had been there since they moved into the house 11 years ago, when the girls were still in elementary school and the subdivision was new enough that half the lots were still vacant. It was a sound you stopped hearing after a while, the way you stopped noticing the refrigerator compressor or the distant highway traffic. But James had been listening to it more carefully lately, and what he heard troubled him. The pitch was slightly higher than he remembered, a tension in the drone that suggested the transformer was working harder than it should. He made a mental note to check the utilities service bulletins again after breakfast, then turned back to his family and said nothing. He worked from home most days, troubleshooting network infrastructure for a logistics company that moved freight across the Midwest, coordinating server migrations and emergency patches from a converted bedroom at the back of the house. The job demanded stable power, stable internet, and a stable head, and he had built his entire professional life around those 3 pillars. But over the past month, he had been noticing things that made him question how solid those pillars really were. Small things at first. The flicker on the microwave, a brownout that lasted 15 minutes on a Saturday afternoon, just long enough to corrupt an unsaved spreadsheet and knock his router offline. A neighbor 2 streets over, mentioning that his sump pump had failed during the last thunderstorm because the breaker tripped and never reset properly, flooding his basement with 3 inches of muddy water that ruined 2 decades of stored belongings. James started reading the local utilities service bulletins with the kind of attention most people reserved for weather forecasts before a vacation. Infrastructure upgrades delayed due to supply chain issues. Record heat driving peak demand to levels the grid was not designed to handle. Maintenance crews stretched thin across a service area covering 4 counties, prioritizing emergency repairs over preventive maintenance. The language was careful, bureaucratic, designed to inform without alarming, but James had spent enough years troubleshooting failing systems to recognize the pattern. This was not a grid operating with comfortable margins. This was a grid running on borrowed time. Most people in the neighborhood treated their electricity the way they treated their heartbeat or the rotation of the earth. It was just there, an invisible constant that required no thought and no preparation. You flipped a switch, the lights came on, and you moved on with your day. If the power went out, it was an inconvenience measured in minutes or hours, never days. The longest outage James could remember in this neighborhood was 6 hours during an ice storm 3 winters ago, and even that had felt like an anomaly, a freak event that would not repeat itself. But James had grown up differently. His father had been a lineman for 30 years, working for a rural electric cooperative in southern Indiana, coming home with stories about ice storms that took down half the grid and summer surges that blew transformers like firecrackers on the 4th of July. He understood what kept the lights on, and more importantly, he understood what could take them down. And what he was seeing now, in the service bulletins and the transformer hum and the flicker on the microwave, looked like a system running too close to the edge. Before you go any further, if you're watching this because you've thought about preparedness, about what happens when the systems we rely on every day stop working, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and have you ever dealt with a long power outage? Let's hear your story. Rebecca was a high school English teacher, practical in most ways, but inclined to let professionals handle the technical side of life. She taught juniors and seniors, Shakespeare and Toni Morrison, and came home most days with papers to grade and a bone-deep weariness that came from spending 8 hours managing teenagers who would rather be anywhere else. Their daughters, Lily at 16 and Sophie at 14, were deep into the summer rhythm of sleeping late, texting friends, and complaining about the heat with the casual entitlement of people who had never experienced genuine discomfort. The house had central air, city water piped in from a treatment plant 12 miles away, and a 2-car garage filled with bikes and camping gear they used once a year. It was comfortable, it was predictable, and none of them could imagine why James spent an entire Saturday afternoon walking the perimeter of their half-acre lot with a shovel and a hand-drawn map, marking potential drill sites with orange spray paint in a pattern that looked like abstract art to anyone who did not understand what he was planning. When he brought it up at dinner that night, Rebecca set her fork down slowly, the way she did when one of her students said something particularly absurd in class, and she needed a moment to formulate a response that would not sound condescending. He explained his plan in the same calm, methodical way he explained server migration schedules at work, laying out the reasoning step by step. The grid was under stress. The utility was issuing warnings about potential rolling blackouts. They were likely looking at more outages as the summer progressed, possibly longer ones. City water depended on electric pumps at the treatment plant and booster stations throughout the distribution network. If the power went out for more than a day or two, those pumps would stop running and they would lose water pressure. Maybe lose water entirely. He wanted to drill a shallow well in the backyard and install a hand pump. Independent system. No electricity required. Gravity and muscle power. A backup that would work whether the grid was up or down. Rebecca looked at him like he had suggested they start raising chickens in the living room or building a bunker under the garage. Their younger daughter, Sophie, laughed and asked if they were going to build an outhouse next, maybe start churning their own butter. Their older daughter, Lily, just sighed and went back to her phone, thumb scrolling through an endless feed of people who were not talking about hand pumps and water tables. Rebecca kept her voice even, but the edge was there, the tone she used when she was trying to be patient with someone who was not thinking clearly. They lived in a suburb, not a homestead. The city had backup generators at the treatment plant. The utility had contingency plans for outages, and even if the power did go out, it would be a few hours, maybe a day at most. Emergency crews would have it fixed before anyone had to seriously adjust. She reminded him that they had a mortgage, 2 car payments and college tuition coming up in 2 years for Lily. Spending money on a hand pump well was not a priority. It was not even on the list. James did not argue. He had learned years ago that arguing with Rebecca in front of the girls only made everyone defensive and accomplished nothing. He nodded, cleared the table, and went to his office to finish a network audit that was due Monday morning. But the next morning, after Rebecca had left for a summer curriculum meeting and the girls were still asleep, he called a well-drilling contractor, whose number he had saved 3 weeks earlier. The contractor's name was Vincent, a man in his late 50s with forearms like fence posts and a truck that smelled like diesel and mud, and 30 years of outdoor work. He showed up on a Wednesday afternoon, walked the yard with James, and listened to the plan without interrupting. Vincent had the quiet competence of someone who had drilled 1,000 wells and knew exactly which questions to ask. How deep did James want to go? What was the water table depth in this area? Did he want a casing or just a driven point? What kind of pump was he thinking? James had done his research, spending late nights reading geology surveys and well-drilling forums and old homesteading manuals his father had given him. The water table sat around 30 feet in their part of the county, shallow enough to reach with a basic auger rig. He wanted a 2-inch PVC casing with a hand pump rated for depths up to 40 feet. Simple, reliable. No moving parts except the piston and the handle. Nothing that could break down or require specialized repair. Vincent quoted him $3,000 for the full job, including materials, labor, a concrete collar to prevent surface contamination, and a 1-year guarantee on the casing. It was more than James had budgeted, but less than he had feared. He wrote the check that afternoon, a personal check from an account Rebecca rarely monitored because it was designated for home maintenance and unexpected repairs. Vincent said he could start Monday, weather permitting, and left with a handshake that felt like a commitment carved in stone. Rebecca found the receipt 2 days later while sorting through mail on the kitchen counter, a habit she had developed after James forgot to pay the electric bill 1 month, and they received a disconnect notice. She did not yell. Rebecca rarely yelled. She just looked at him across the kitchen counter, her expression somewhere between disbelief and frustration, and asked what he was thinking. He told her he was thinking about the transformer box, the service bulletins, and the fact that their daughters drank 3 gallons of water a day between showers, cooking and hydration. He told her he was thinking about what happened when the grid failed, not if, and how quickly comfortable became desperate when you had no access to the most basic resource humans needed to survive. She told him he was being paranoid. He told her he hoped she was right. She told him he had just spent $3,000 on a solution to a problem that did not exist. He told her it existed whether she acknowledged it or not. The conversation ended there, unresolved, and Rebecca did not mention the well again. Vincent showed up the following Monday with a truck-mounted auger and a helper who looked barely old enough to drive, a kid with sunburned arms and a work ethic that Vincent praised 3 times in the first hour. They started drilling at 8 in the morning, and James watched from the back porch as the auger bit chewed through the earth in a steady, grinding rhythm. The first 10 feet went quickly, soft topsoil and clay that parted like butter under the rotating steel. Then they hit a layer of compacted sand that slowed the progress, the engine straining as the helper added weight to the drill frame. By noon, they had punched through 28 feet of clay, sand, and decomposed limestone, pulling up cores that told the story of ancient riverbeds and glacial deposits. At 32 feet, the auger bit hit saturated gravel, and the helper pulled up a sample that smelled like wet earth and cold stone, the unmistakable signature of groundwater. Vincent nodded, shut down the rig, and told James they had water. Good flow, clean aquifer, no sulfur smell or mineral contamination. They were in business. They set the casing next, a process that took another 3 hours. The PVC pipe had to be lowered carefully into the borehole, sealed sections fitted together with threaded couplings and adhesive to prevent leaks. At the bottom, 30 feet down, they attached a foot valve, a simple one-way check valve that would allow water to enter the pipe but not flow back out. Then they poured a concrete collar around the top of the casing, mixing the cement on site and smoothing it into a raised platform that would keep surface water and contaminants from seeping into the well. By mid-afternoon, the concrete had set enough to install the pump, and Vincent bolted the cast-iron baseplate directly to the collar with lag screws that sank into the concrete like teeth. The pump itself was a simple lever mechanism mounted on a steel shaft. You worked the handle up and down, and the piston inside the casing pulled water up from the aquifer through the foot valve at the bottom. The first few strokes brought up air and sediment, a brown sludge that smelled like earth and tasted like minerals. Then the water came, cold and clear, spilling out of the spout and pooling in the grass with a sound like rain on a metal roof. Vincent tested it for 10 minutes, checking the seal and the flow rate, adjusting the piston rod to eliminate wobble, then handed the handle to James. He worked it a dozen times, feeling the resistance as the piston pulled against the weight of the water column below, and watched the stream arc out into the sunlight. Vincent told him to prime it once a week, keep the seals greased with food-grade silicone, and avoid letting the piston sit dry for extended periods. Other than that, it would outlast the house, probably outlast James. Rebecca watched from the kitchen window while Vincent packed up his tools and drove away. She did not come outside. She did not comment on the well. When James came back inside, sweating and covered in dust, she was grading essays at the dining room table, red pen moving across the page in short, sharp strokes. He told her the well was done. She said that was nice. He told her he was going to test it every few days, make sure everything was working properly. She said he should do whatever he thought was best. The conversation died there, and the well became one of those subjects that existed in the space between them, acknowledged but never discussed. The principle behind a hand pump well is older than electricity and simpler than most people expect. You're not pulling water out of the ground through suction alone, because suction can only lift water about 30 feet at sea level, limited by atmospheric pressure. Instead, the pump uses a check valve at the bottom of the casing, submerged below the water table where the groundwater flows in through perforations in the pipe. When you lift the handle, the piston rises inside the cylinder, creating a vacuum below it and pulling water up through the valve. When you push the handle down, the valve closes, trapping the water above it, and the piston forces that water up the pipe and out the spout. Each stroke moves a few ounces, maybe a pint depending on the pump design and the depth of the well. Repeat it enough times and you fill a bucket. No batteries, no electricity, no moving parts that require specialized knowledge to repair. Just leverage and physics and human effort. James tested the well every few days over the next 2 weeks, filling 5-gallon buckets and hauling them to the garden to water the tomatoes and peppers Rebecca had planted in May. It took about 40 strokes to fill a bucket, roughly 2 minutes of steady work. He timed himself with a stopwatch, recording the data in a small notebook he kept in the garage. 50 buckets a day would give them enough water for drinking, cooking, basic hygiene, and some margin for waste. That translated to a little over an hour and a half of pumping, spread across the day, manageable, sustainable, and completely independent of the power grid. His daughters walked past the pump a few times but never used it. To them, it was just another weird thing their father had built, like the rain barrel he had installed last summer, or the compost bin he maintained in the far corner of the yard. Rebecca acknowledged it only once, when a friend came over for coffee in late July and asked what the metal contraption in the backyard was for. Rebecca smiled and said James had a new hobby, something about preparedness and self-reliance. The friend laughed and said her husband was the same way, always worried about things that would never happen. They moved on to safer topics, school schedules and vacation plans, and the well became part of the background scenery, as unremarkable as the fence or the garden shed. Life went on exactly as it had before, except now there was a hand pump well sitting 20 feet from the back porch, waiting for a crisis that Rebecca insisted would never come. The first real test came on a Saturday afternoon in mid-July, a day so hot the asphalt in the driveway felt soft underfoot. James was in his office on a video call with a client in Ohio, troubleshooting a database migration that had gone sideways overnight, when the screen went black. Not a freeze, not a glitch, just instant darkness, the kind that comes when power is cut completely. The lights stayed on for another second, some residual charge bleeding out of the system, then dropped. The air conditioner sighed and went silent. He heard Rebecca call his name from the kitchen, her voice sharp with surprise but not yet alarm. He walked out into the hallway and found her standing by the refrigerator, holding the door open like she expected the interior light to flicker back on if she just gave it a moment. Their daughters were upstairs, already complaining loudly, voices echoing down the stairwell. James checked his phone. No service. The cell tower was down too, which meant the outage was not isolated to their house or their block. This was grid level. He went outside and looked up and down the street. Every house was dark. A neighbor across the road was standing on his front lawn, hands on his hips staring at the utility pole like he could will the power back on, through sheer force of irritation. Another neighbor, an older man who had lived here since the subdivision was built, was getting into his car, probably heading to a store or a gas station to get answers. James walked back inside, grabbed 2 5-gallon buckets from the garage, and headed for the well. The pump worked exactly as it had during every test. He filled both buckets in less than 5 minutes, carried them inside, and set them on the kitchen counter. Rebecca looked at the buckets, then at him. She asked how long he thought the power would be out. He told her he did not know, but they had water either way. She nodded slowly, her skepticism softening just a degree, and asked if he thought this was what he had been preparing for. He told her he did not know that either. The power came back 4 hours later, just as the sun was setting, and the house had started to cool down naturally. The air conditioner roared to life, the lights blazed, and their daughters cheered from upstairs like they had just won a championship. Rebecca poured the water from the buckets into a storage container under the sink and told James it was good to have a backup. He did not say anything. He just went back outside and primed the pump one more time before dark, checking the seals and greasing the handle pivot. Over the next 3 weeks, the grid stumbled twice more. Once on a Tuesday evening, out for 90 minutes during dinner. They ate by flashlight, The girls complaining about their phones dying. Rebecca staying quiet and focused. Once on a Thursday morning, out for 20 minutes, while James was on a conference call. He switched to his phone's hotspot and kept working, but the interruption cost him 15 minutes of troubleshooting time and nearly derailed a critical patch deployment. Each time James filled the buckets. Each time Rebecca found a reason to explain why the well was not really necessary. The outages were short, the utility was working on upgrades. It was just summer demand, nothing to worry about. The transformer had probably been overloaded by everyone running their air conditioners at the same time. And each time, the power came back before anyone had to seriously adjust, before anyone had to ration water or change their routine. It was easy to believe that the worst-case scenario would never arrive, because it never had. Then the heat wave hit, and everything changed. It started the first week of August, a high-pressure system that parked itself over the region and refused to move. Temperatures climbed into the upper 90s by mid-morning and stayed there until after sunset, turning the house into an oven even with the air conditioner running constantly. The humidity made the air feel like a wet towel pressed against your face, thick and oppressive and inescapable. Every air conditioner in the county ran at full capacity, and the utilities' load projections turned red across the board. James watched the news reports and read the alerts from the power company with increasing concern. They were asking customers to reduce usage during peak hours. They were warning about potential rolling blackouts to protect the grid. They were using words like unprecedented demand and capacity limits and unforeseen stress on infrastructure that was not designed for this level of sustained load. On a Wednesday afternoon, the transformer box at the corner of James's yard made a sound like a shotgun blast, a sharp crack that echoed across the neighborhood and sent a flock of starlings exploding out of a nearby oak tree. He was outside, checking the seals on the well pump and wiping dust off the handle when it happened. He looked up in time to see a brief flash of white light inside the transformer housing, followed by a curl of smoke rising from the vents. The hum stopped. The air conditioner stopped, and every house on the block went dark at once, 50 homes losing power in the same instant, like someone had thrown a master switch. James did not wait for an official update. He went straight to the well, filled 6 buckets, and lined them up inside the garage, where they would stay cool in the shade. Then he filled the bathtub, every pot and pan in the kitchen, the 2 large coolers they kept for camping trips, and 3 plastic storage bins he dragged down from the attic. Rebecca helped without comment, her face tight with focus, moving through the house with the kind of efficiency she brought to lesson planning when a deadline was approaching. By the time the sun set, they had stored nearly 60 gallons of water inside the house, enough for 3 or 4 days if they were careful. James primed the pump one more time, locked the back door, and told his family to ration what they had until morning. They would reassess then, depending on what the utility said. The power did not come back in the morning. It did not come back that afternoon. By the second day, the utility's automated message confirmed what James had suspected from the moment he saw the smoke. The transformer serving their neighborhood was one of 11 units that had failed across the county, overwhelmed by sustained peak load and heat stress. Parts were on back order. Crews were prioritizing hospitals, water treatment facilities, and other critical infrastructure. Residential repairs would follow, but estimates ranged from 5 days to 2 weeks, depending on supply chain delays and the availability of replacement transformers. The message ended with a reminder to stay hydrated, check on vulnerable neighbors, and report any downed power lines immediately. Rebecca's calm fractured on the 3rd day. The refrigerator had become a warm, sour-smelling box they kept sealed to trap what little coolness remained, the food inside beginning to spoil in the relentless heat. The toilets still flushed, but the city had issued a boil water advisory after the main pumping station lost backup generator power during a brief brownout. The pressure in the municipal system was dropping as neighborhoods across the county drew down reserves faster than the pumps could replenish them. The house was stifling, the air thick and motionless, every room radiating heat like the inside of a kiln. Their daughters were irritable, sweating through their clothes, asking every hour when the power would be back, and receiving the same non-answer every time. And Rebecca, standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed and sweat darkening her shirt, finally admitted out loud what she had been trying not to think. They needed water, and the city could not provide it. James showed her how to work the pump. He stood next to her at the well, positioned her hands on the handle, and guided her through the first few strokes. The mechanism was simple, but the effort was not. It was harder than it looked, the resistance building as the piston pulled against the weight of the water column 30 feet below, and her arms shook after the first bucket. She asked how many times he had been doing this every day. He told her 50 buckets, sometimes more. She stared at the buckets at the well at the street where 2 neighbors were loading their cars to leave for a hotel an hour away, and then she went inside, came back with their daughters, and made them learn to pump. Lily complained that it was unfair. Sophie said her arms hurt after 3 strokes. Rebecca told them both that life was unfair, arms healed, and they were going to learn this whether they wanted to or not. By the 4th day, the well had become the center of their routine, the axis around which everything else revolved. Morning pump session before the heat peaked, filling every available container. Midday break with minimal exertion, everyone retreating to the coolest rooms and lying still to conserve energy. Evening pump session before dark, refilling what they had used during the day. They stored the water in every container they owned, rotating through supplies as they cooked, cleaned and rationed drinking water, with the kind of discipline normally reserved for wilderness survival scenarios. James rigged a solar shower using a black plastic bag and some paracord, hanging it from a tree branch and letting the sun heat the water to a tolerable temperature. It was not comfortable, but it was functional, and every day, without fail, the well delivered exactly what they needed. The neighbors started noticing. On the 5th day, a man from 3 houses down walked over and asked if he could buy a bucket of water. His name was Greg, a software engineer who worked for a startup downtown, and his family had been relying on bottled water from a grocery store 15 miles away. But the shelves were empty now, cleared out by panic buying, and the lines at the emergency distribution centers were 3 hours long in the brutal heat. James filled his bucket without asking for payment. Greg thanked him, said he wished he had thought ahead like James had, and walked back to his house carrying the bucket like it weighed 50 pounds. By the 6th day, 4 more neighbors had asked, forming a quiet procession to the well at dawn and dusk. James and his daughters took turns at the well, filling buckets and hauling them to the edge of the property line where people could pick them up. Rebecca watched from the porch, her expression unreadable, and finally said what James had been waiting to hear. She had been wrong to scoff at him. The false positive came on the 7th day, when the utility sent out a notification that repairs were ahead of schedule and power restoration would begin within 24 hours. Rebecca read the message aloud at breakfast, and Sophie cheered, already planning what she would do first when the internet came back. Even Rebecca allowed herself a smile, the kind of relief that only comes when you think the worst is over and normalcy is just around the corner. James said nothing. He had read enough infrastructure reports during his years troubleshooting logistics networks to know that ahead of schedule often meant less behind than we thought, and that within 24 hours carried no guarantees when you were dealing with supply chains and specialized equipment. But he did not argue. He just kept pumping, filling buckets and hauling water like nothing had changed. 24 hours passed, then 36. The utility's next message walked back the timeline. Parts had arrived, but installation was more complicated than anticipated. Estimate now pushed to 72 hours, then 96. The heat wave showed no sign of breaking, the high-pressure system locked in place like a fixture on the weather map. And on the 10th day, a county health official confirmed what everyone had been whispering about for the past 48 hours. 2 elderly residents in a neighboring suburb had died from heat-related complications after losing access to running water and air conditioning, their bodies discovered by concerned neighbors who had not seen them in days. The official urged anyone without power to relocate to cooling centers, but the centers were overcrowded and running low on supplies, and the shelters had started turning people away. You were safer at home if you had water, and James had water. The power came back on the afternoon of the 10th day, rolling through the grid in stages as crews brought transformers online neighborhood by neighborhood. James was at the well, filling the last bucket of the afternoon, when he heard the hum return. That steady electric thrum from the pole at the corner of the yard, the sound he had been listening to for 11 years without really hearing it until it was gone. The air conditioner kicked on inside the house with a roar that sounded like salvation. He heard his daughters scream with joy, actual screaming, the kind of unrestrained relief that comes when comfort returns after prolonged deprivation. Rebecca came outside, her face flushed with relief and exhaustion, and walked across the lawn to where he stood beside the well. She did not say anything for a long moment. She just put her hand on the pump handle, feeling the worn metal under her palm, and said, "Thank you." That evening, after the house had cooled and everyone had showered, and the refrigerator was restocked with fresh groceries from a store that had reopened that afternoon, Rebecca sat down with James at the kitchen table. She told him she had been wrong. Not just about the well, but about the entire framework she had been using to think about their lives. She had assumed the system would always work, because it always had, that the infrastructure supporting their comfortable existence was permanent and unshakable, and when it stopped working, she had watched him keep their family safe with a piece of infrastructure she had scoffed at, dismissed as paranoid and unnecessary. She asked what else they should be preparing for. He told her they would figure it out together. That preparation was not about predicting specific disasters, but about building resilience against the categories of failure that could disrupt any system. The well stayed. James maintained it every week, greasing the seals and running a few test strokes to keep the piston from seizing and the leather washers from drying out. Their daughters used it occasionally, filling watering cans for the garden or hauling buckets when they needed an outdoor project that would justify extra screen time later. Lily even brought a friend over to show her how it worked, demonstrating the pumping technique with the casual pride of someone who had mastered a practical skill her peers did not possess. The neighbors who had borrowed water during the blackout stopped by every few weeks to check in, sometimes bringing vegetables from their own gardens or offering help with yard work as an informal repayment. One of them, Greg from 3 houses down, started researching his own well and called Vincent in September. Another installed a rainwater collection system and a series of storage barrels. The blackout had not just proven James right, it had started a quiet shift in how people thought about the infrastructure they relied on and what happened when it failed. 6 months later, the county utility completed its grid upgrades, installing new transformers with higher capacity ratings and improved cooling systems. The service bulletins stopped warning about capacity limits and rolling blackouts. The transformer at the corner of James's yard was replaced with a newer, higher-rated unit that hummed at a lower pitch, a sound that no longer triggered the same concern in his mind. The rolling blackouts stopped. The heat wave broke. Life returned to normal, or at least the version of normal where everyone had functioning electricity and running water, and the summer was just a season instead of a test. But the well remained, a metal fixture in the backyard that no one questioned anymore. Rebecca planted flowers around the base in October, turning it into a feature instead of an oddity, a functional piece of sculpture. And every time James walked past it, checking the seals or running a few test strokes, he remembered the 10 days when it had been the only thing standing between his family and a very different outcome. The lesson was not complicated, but it was profound. Preparation looks like paranoia until the moment it doesn't. The systems we depend on are more fragile than we want to believe, built on assumptions about resource availability, infrastructure resilience, and external conditions that can change faster than anyone expects. The gap between comfort and crisis can close in an instant, measured not in weeks or days, but in the time it takes for a transformer to blow or a generator to fail. James had not built the well because he knew the blackout was coming. He had built it because he understood that grids fail, transformers overheat, and infrastructure runs on margins that narrow every year as demand increases and maintenance budgets shrink. And when those margins disappeared, when the comfortable assumptions collapsed under the weight of reality, he had something in place that did not depend on them. The well is still there, a quiet monument to the value of thinking ahead. The grid is still there, humming along with its new transformers and upgraded capacity. And somewhere between those two facts, in the space where self-reliance meets systemic fragility, is the margin that kept one family whole when everything else went dark. The neighbors know it. Rebecca knows it, and even the daughters who once scoffed alongside their mother know it now. They learned it the hard way, pumping water in 100-degree heat while their friends evacuated to hotels or suffered through the crisis without the one resource that made everything else possible. They learned it in a way that no amount of explanation or argument could have taught them, through lived experience and immediate consequences. James still reads the utilities service bulletins, but he reads them differently now. Not as warnings of potential failure, but as confirmation that his preparation was justified and remains necessary. Because the heat wave will return. The grid will falter, and when it does, the well will be waiting, ready to deliver exactly what it promised on the day Vincent bolted the pump to the concrete collar and handed James the handle. Water, independence, survival on terms that do not depend on fragile systems or optimistic assumptions. Just physics, leverage, and the willingness to act before the crisis arrives,